Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, Wendell Marsh discusses the genealogy of African Islamic modernity. Wendell Marsh is an associate professor of African literature and philosophy at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Ben Gurion, Morocco. Professor Marsh examines African Islamic modernity as a complex historical project that highlights the entanglements between African racial identities, Islamic ways of life, and global modernity, using Senegal as a case study for understanding these relationships. Through analyzing three key historical episodes, Islamic Revolution, anti-colonial messianism, and racial accommodation between colonial states and Sufi orders, Professor Marsh demonstrates how African Islamic societies have consistently escaped both Africanist and Orientalist scholarly inquisition. He charts a new pathway to scholarship on modernity that challenges conventional academic boundaries and reveals alternative genealogies of modern thought. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic at the intersection of religion, race, and political identity.
I shared the title Genealogy of African Islamic Modernity as which really is the subtitle of my book project, what I'm currently working on. And I ended up deciding to zoom out a little bit further just to get a sense of the project as a whole. So African Islamic modernity is really a concept that I'm trying to develop to think through entanglements, right? So typically, historically, scholars have approached Islam in Africa as if it's really not a part of the kind of authentic African modernity, if you will. More recent work, there's a new generation of scholars for whom that's not at all true. That in fact is very much Islam is essential for a country like Senegal for understanding its modernity. And so, what I'm trying to do with this concept is, participate with this new wave of scholarship, but to really still emphasize that these kind of very large conceptual discourses that we use to understand the world have developed along with each other. And so that's what I am working out in my work as a kind of overall statement. I will say before starting in earnest, however, that the recent events in Senegal, there's been kind of almost unprecedented scale of popular protests in support of an opposition candidate. And one of the reasons why it's unprecedented is kind of where it falls in the election cycle. And it really challenges long-held assumptions about Senegalese political culture. But I can't really reflect those current developments in my talk today. But it's an important development that is worth looking into. So the streets of Dakar, Senegal, teemed with the Gaza solidarity protests during the onslaught of the summer of 2014. Talking heads met on the top news show to discuss the matter. Bakri Samb, a Senegalese professor of Islamic studies, and Tariq Ramadan, a once major figure of global Islam, who have since fallen from grace following accusations of sexual assault, faced off. The debate quickly descended into an exchange of verbal fire. Ramadan accused Samb of having a colonized mind. At a momentary loss for words, Samb hit back at Ramadan, saying, "It is you who are the first colonizers, you Arabs." Once tempers cooled, Samb wrote on his blog to clarify the statement that had originally solicited Ramadan's insult. He spoke neither from Paris nor from Washington, as Ramadan had suggested, but from Gangle, a small village on the left bank of the middle Senegal River. This small place, connected by a long, rough dirt road, in which had only recently been put on the electrical grid when I visited that year, 2014, is a far cry from the centers of France-Afrique and American Empire. Yet for Samb, Gangle symbolized an autonomous tradition of enlightened modern Islam, an Islam that was peaceful, tolerant, and learned. This was so because Gangle was the longtime home of Shaykh Musa Kamara, a colonial-era Muslim scholar. While the invocation of this remote locale, an obscure figure in a discussion of pressing world affairs, may seem out of place, it fit perfectly within the discourse of the Senegalese exception. The idea that Senegal's unique expression of Sufi Islam accounts for its democratic values, capitalist ethos of hard work, and religious tolerance, in contrast to other African and Muslim societies. So what I am really talking about today is how Kamara has been kind of mobilized in kind of two contradictory ways, what I call two contradictory genealogies of African Islamic modernity. And I argue that these two genealogies demonstrate how Kamara is conscripted into the discourse of exception, but also potentially disrupts its underlying premises. In that way, Kamara teaches us about Senegal's engagement with the global and what resisted. So, as I was saying before, contemporary scholarship has tried to go beyond the racial underpinnings of the concept of Islam noir. This was originally a French colonial theory that sought to streamline the work of governance by using race as an explanation of everything. It posited that on the one hand, it was the blackness of their colonial subjects in Senegal that made them less rational, more inclined to ecstatic devotion, and more docile than other Muslims. On the other hand, it was their subjects' Islam that gave them literacy, monotheism, and historical consciousness, all of which made them vital intermediary agents for the civilizing mission. In an attempt to get beyond these racial ideals, scholars have increasingly focused on the global themes, such as circulation, contact, and connectivity, and as well as intellectual themes such as textual production, scholarly discourses, and epistemology. These are considered counter-thematics to former racialisms, which emphasize African particularity, backwardsness, and irrationality. While scholarly work of this mode has done well to revise how academics speak about Islam in West Africa, the emergent common sense still traffics in a theoretical paradigm elaborated in colonial rule and through religious governance, that is, the Senegalese exception. Senegal is a Muslim majority country of 16 million people that occupies the westernmost territory of the African continent. It is considered exceptional for its peaceful political stability and economic vitality when compared to its African neighbors, and for its religious tolerance and vibrant cultural expression when juxtaposed to non-Black Muslim societies. Both inside and outside the country, the explanation for why Senegal is the exception to both the African and Muslim rule is the prominence of Sufi Islam there, a tradition of spiritual contemplation and experience transmitted through chains of hierarchical master-disciple relationships and institutionalized in religious orders. The most notable of these in Senegal include the Mouridiyya Sufi order, founded by Sheikh Hamdou Bamba Mbake, and the Tijaniya Sufi order, originally founded in southern Algeria, but with several local branches. A good example of the Senegalese exception put to work as an idea and kind of an explanation for everything is a recent recent story on PBS NewsHour that highlighted the role of Sufi orders in making Senegal number 2 and having the lowest number of COVID cases, behind only New Zealand. At this point, these numbers are current, but there was this news story that highlighted the role of these orders. In contrast to Senegalese Sufism, Salafism, an Islamic religious movement that emphasizes ritual purity and is often incorrectly conflated with jihad as a political ideology, is constructed as an outgrowth of a foreign and dangerous influence. Recognized as good Muslims as opposed to supposedly bad Salafi ones, Sufis and indirectly the Senegalese state have been viewed as dependable partners in the global war on terror. Put differently, exception is the name of the field of ambiguity produced in the encounter of Islam and Blackness as located in Senegal. In my book project, The Senegalese Exception, A Genealogy of African Islamic Modernity, I interrogate the premises of Islam Noir and its reinstantiation as the Senegalese exception by opening up a genealogy of the African Islamic modern. In contrast to the conventional representations of Africa as traditional and Islam as being anti-modern somehow, I use this phrase, African Islamic modernity, to refer to a discourse, a historical condition, and a project that highlights the entanglements of African racial identities, Islamic forms of life, and modernity as the globally hegemonic mode of social, economic, and political being. So that's a lot. Let me break that down a little bit, right? So typically when the discussion of modernity highlights essentially what I'm calling modes of being, so this is can be glossed as individualism, free market capitalism, and constitutional liberal democracy. The main point that I'm making is that in the case of Senegal, these modern forms have taken shape over a very long period of interaction. By Islamic forms of life, I mean the assemblage of practices, beliefs, and repertoires, as well as existing and possible meanings associated with the hermeneutical engagement with the Quran and the embodied model of the Prophet Muhammad. And this formulation is very much influenced by Shahab Ahmed and Talal Asad. By genealogy, I mean two things. First, it refers to differential and critical histories of the present that work to trace the relations of power and knowledge backwards from our certainties to other paths. Second, genealogy refers to a criticism by the colonial era Muslim scholar Shaykh Musa Kamara, who challenged the naturalization of claims of power based on claims of descent and kinship. In effect, I use Kamara as a counter-theorist of the Senegalese exception. In particular, I offer a constellation of compositional and contextualist readings of his Ash'al al-Ulum wa at-Tayyib al-Khabar fi Sirat Haj Omar, or the most delicious of the sciences and the tastiest of the news in the biography of Haj Omar. This is a hagiographic text about the life, legacy, and lineage of the important Tijani Sufi personality Haj Omar Tal. Kamara was born around 1864 in the easternmost part of what was at the time Futa Toro, an Islamic political formation. Futa Toro was established in 1776 by a movement led by Muslim scholars that had sought to limit the vulnerability of the population to enslavement in the Atlantic world. And increasingly, scholars have written about this episode. In particular, Rudolf Ware makes the argument that this was an abolitionist movement. I call this the first episode of African Islamic modernity, when the state form, the nation state form, emerges out of popular revolution. By the time of Kamara's birth in 1864, however, the autonomy of this agriculturally rich region had been compromised by the French domination of the river-based trade in cloth and gum Arabic. Right? These are all, gum Arabic is an all-important raw material, for both the global print revolution that took place in the 19th century, but also for the massive textile industry, which really had a disproportionate effect in industrialization writ large on the global scale. Furthermore, Futatoro had been weakened because of the outbound immigration of the inhabitants to participate in the campaigns of Tal farther east. Tal was the militant leader of the Tijaniya Sufi order who transformed the political, social, and intellectual geography of the Western Sahel, right, the semi-arid zone below the Sahara Desert during the middle of the 19th century. Tal had traveled widely in the Middle East, where intellectual ferment and political projects to respond to European colonialism were the order of the day. The transformations marked by his initiatives were defined by both the expansion of the French colony and their attempts to rationalize the river-based trade, but also its interaction with the messianic hopes of forging an autonomous space of Islamic economics with the partisans of Umar Tal. This I call the second episode of Islamic Modernity, where we see the kind of arguments of people like Haj Umar Tal kind of anticipating the kinds of discussions we see today around kind of Sharia compliant capitalism. This is an argument that I'm trying to develop. The period of Kamara's prolific writing corresponds to the third episode of African Islamic Modernity, when the major Sufi orders established the terms of what is known as the Senegalese social contract, right, in negotiation with the colonial state. This was a durable arrangement in which the orders organized around saintly lineages would mediate the relationship between state and society, particularly in rural areas. It was in this position they could compensate for the shortcomings of the stereotypical African weak state, and but also to moderate potential religious exuberance, right? So it was a matter of managing religion. These three episodes of African Islamic modernity reflect the elements of Senegal's past that have been distilled into a narrative in the present. And here I should elaborate that I use episodes as opposed to periods or moments, because I'm really emphasizing the narrative effect of way people talk about the past and how it's made available for contemporary argument. So as in much of the Muslim world in Senegal today, Islam has replaced the nation as a horizon of consciousness. It provides the dominant mode of socialization and participation in public life. The present, or a complex conjuncture of events and processes that include the Iranian Revolution, the implementation of structural adjustment programs, and political liberalization, as well, of course, the global war on terror, emphasizes, and if that kind of calls for a certain idea that a substantive modernity in Senegal is not simply a product of being colonized, right? And at the same time, the present is calls for asserting the autonomy of Senegalese religion, right? So in the encounter that I started with, we see this argument being made, especially against racial claims of superiority by anti-Blackness as a kind of global organizing principle. So trained in a department of critical interdisciplinary area studies that brought together intellectual history, post-colonial criticism, and textual studies, I'm particularly interested in how the discourse and historical condition of African Islamic modernity relies on Arabic script texts as artifacts of a pre-colonial past, as evidence of intellectual autonomy, and as a metonym through which broader struggles in the Islamic field are articulated. Because Kamara's texts were written from the margin of both colonial space and what would become the scholarly Muslim establishment of the Sufi orders, it constitutes a resource for thinking the inheritances that characterize Senegal's present, one that is productively called African Islamic modernity. So what I had planned next is a bit of a deep dive. I will spare the audience that. Basically, I go to the text of Kamara's text, where he is actually recounting the genealogy, the kind of literal family lines of Hajj Omar Tal. And he is writing, of course, in kind of 1935, this interwar period. And one of the things I'm interested in is in this disproportionately large chapter in this particular text that he appears most critical. And he essentially dismisses a claim of prophetic descent for Hajj Omar Tal. And in so doing, he actually makes an argument against the entire scaffolding, genealogical scaffolding of a certain elite, a kind of Muslim elite in West Africa from across the kind of famous Islamic political formations, Futa Toro, Futa Jalon, Sokoto. These are kind of northern Nigeria, Guinea, Mali today. By critiquing the entire genealogical scaffolding, he's critiquing this idea of a kind of naturalized authority by birth. And this is relevant to the example I started with because he actually tackles with this common misconception that there was an Islamic conquest of West Africa. And he basically shows that the conquest was a non-event. It didn't happen, but it was a very slow, gradual process of conversion. One of the reasons why I think this is interesting is because, since at least Ahmed Baba in the 16th century Timbuktu, this is the kind of argument that critical Muslim scholars are constantly having to make against the presumption of there having been a sweeping Islamic conquest, and implied that, this implication that there is that there was, that we see with someone like Bakr Sam, a colonization, an Islamic colonization of some sort, right? But I'm skipping that part, and I'll just conclude and wrap up by saying that Kamara is interesting as a way of tracking the broader intellectual history of Senegal, and more broadly of kind of the Sahelian West Africa, Muslim West Africa, because we see the various relations of knowledge and power through different iterations. So during the colonial period, his work was filtered through the kind of paradigm of surveillance, right? It was about to what extent, what could he provide useful information for the work of governance. Ultimately, it was decided that it wasn't. And so he kind of was dismissed and disappeared. And this mammoth work that he writes, a 1,700-page history of West Africa, kind of doesn't disappear, but goes into the archive. It's not acknowledged. He's resurrected in the 1960s, the 1970s, because he represents for nationalist historiography this ideal embodiment of pre-colonial historical consciousness, right, with which one could prove that Africa had a history too and had historical thought. But then finally, what I think is interesting about more recent developments is where surveillance and nationalist historiography provided the frame. What we see emerging is a kind of secular religious framework. And by secular religion, I'm talking about the broader moral and epistemological conditions in which we think religion, right? So the transformations, even the concept of religion, have undergone, throughout modernity. So I began this discussion with a racial encounter of two Muslim public intellectuals in which crypto-racial insults stood in for political debate. Following this conversation, Shaykh Musa Kamara was invoked as a historical and intellectual reference that embodied a modern African Islam that was tolerant, learned, and autonomous. In effect, a secular Islam. In order to understand this deployment of Kamara as a key reference, I described a genealogy of conscription in which Kamara's intellectual production has been appropriated by colonial surveillance, national historiography, and most recently for the making of a good Islam compatible with secularity. I also explored I simply gestured toward the genealogy of disruption, a counter history that resists the way many people might want to kind of appropriate the use of Kamara for various ends. There is a certain irony that I have been grasping for in this talk. On the one hand, Dr. Issam invokes Kamara to assert an anti-racist argument in the present, but in order to do so, he has to concede an ambiguity relating to the legacy of Islam's history in Africa when he suggests that there was an Arab colonization. This is a fairly common misconception that is as common in the Muslim world as it is outside of it. This fits a vision of humanity where the terms Africa, Islam, and modernity represent cultural essences that are distinct from one another. However, reading Kamara, we learn of a different position, one that has been asserted time and again by more critical Muslim scholars from West Africa. The fact that a country like Senegal today boasts a Muslim majority is not the result of an event of conquest that serves as proof of a cosmic anti-Blackness, but rather a slow process of conversion. What this highlights then is the fact of entanglement, a condition of the global present in which African racial identities, Islam, and modernity are wrapped up in each other. Taking Kamara as a counter-theorist of African Islamic modernity then allows us to appreciate the non-Western histories and intellectual traditions that challenge the common sense of global hegemony.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.